Good evening. Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here for our third of 3 lectures as a part of the Outdoor Alliance Winter Lecture Series. Next month you get to be outdoors enjoying being in the prairie, I hope, next month. But for the last 3 months we've had terrific lectures, and I'm really grateful to our partners who are the Outdoor Alliance of Story County, the Story County Conservation, and Ames Historical Society, all 3 organizations working together with the Ames Public Library to bring this series to you for, I think this is the 3rd year now we've partnered. I just want to remind you that we have a lot happening at the library, so much that it fills about 6 pages here of our monthly newsletter. So I do hope that you'll grab a newsletter on your way out. If you want to cut down on the amount of paper you have in your world, be aware that you can also receive page 1 via email, or just check our library website where our calendar of events will appear in a news feed every single day to tell you what's going on, and you can look at the full month's calendar as well. I just want to give you a heads up. Next month we will be having Ames Reads Leopold again in April, and I also want you to know about our Climate Crisis Facts to Action program, and that series will continue with a program on Wednesday, March 27th. So please find out more about what's happening here at the library, and I hope to see you come back. At this point, I'd like to introduce from the Outdoor Alliance of Story County, Bruce White, who will introduce our special speaker. Bruce.
Thank you, Mary. And also on behalf of the Outdoor Alliance of Story County, I'd like to welcome you here tonight. We really do appreciate our partnership with Ames Public Library and Ames Historical Society and Story County Conservation. They're an integral part in making this series of lectures and presentations possible for the past couple of years, so we really do appreciate their partnership. Over the past 2 months, we've had 2 previous presentations. Back in January, Sam Wormley talked to us about the constellations and the winter sky, some stories and folklore about those. And then last month in February, Christina Murphy I hated to miss it, had a great presentation on the history of the 13th Street Dam, some of the future that is coming for the changes along the 13th Street Dam. So I think you'll find tonight's presentation just as informative. Floral jewels of the Tallgrass Prairie. Prairies, as well as all other ecosystems, are recognized by their vegetation. Not all prairies are the same, however, many types of tallgrass prairie communities can be observed here in Iowa. There's still remnants across the state, as many of you know. The distinctions that make different prairie communities include 3 gradients: moisture, fertility, disturbance, I knew I was going to screw up with that, perturbation, biogeography. And tonight Tom is going to focus on forbs, i.e. prairie wildflowers. For you may not be familiar with the term forbs, play a particularly important role in making the tallgrass prairie. And he's going to talk about that from the perspective of how the prairie is influenced by the forbs. So our speaker is Tom Rosburg, a professor of biology at the Department at Drake University in Des Moines for the past 22 years. He taught 14 courses ranging from biology, ecology, botany, natural history, research and biostatistics, wildland fire, and nature photography. Over his career, Tom has been awarded over $1.5 million in support for in excess of 100 different research projects. Some of the research topics have included plant populations, abundance of plant populations, floristic inventories, seed banks, and ecological restoration. And just recently he was honored by the Iowa Academy of Science as the Distinguished Iowa Scientist Award. So help me welcome Tom Rosburg.
Am I working here for Mike?
You don't? You just flip the switch there, Tom?
I thought I did. Now am I working? All right, there we go. Well, thank you again for the invitation to come and be here tonight. I've not been to an Outdoor Alliance meeting, so sounds like you've had some good talks here. Yeah, and so Greg asked me to come, and he talked about, mentioned something along the lines of floral jewels of the tallgrass prairie, so hence the title. And when I think of floral jewels, and there's actually a book sort of by that name. I can't think of the author off the top of my head right now, but it is a plant ID book that was written for identifying mainly the prairie flowers and wild forbs out in Nebraska. You think about the forbs. So the focus is going to be on the prairie forbs tonight. We're going to kind of put that into sort of the perspective of the entire prairie and talk a little bit about the whole system a little bit and mention the grasses sort of in passing, I guess you might say, but most of it's going to be addressed to the forbs. They provide the most diversity of color and form, and most people are, when they ask a question about a prairie or a prairie plant, they're probably asking about a prairie forb. And it's also going to focus on, as you can see, the Little Prairie, one of our best remnant prairies right here in Story County. So as we get started here, let's think about, first of all, the Tallgrass Prairie and where it sits, and maybe you don't need to know a lot about this, but a little bit of biogeography and a little bit of the ecology here. So the map here shows the biomes of North America. Biomes are really large geographical provinces that have similar climate, similar soils, and similar vegetation. So again, you might be familiar with, of course, the boreal forest, the Arctic tundra way up there, the eastern deciduous forest, and of course in the center here, the central North American grasslands or the Great Plains grasslands. That, of course, is where the Tallgrass Prairie sits. It's a part of that biome system. And it's usually, the system or the biome is usually divided into at least 3 major types of ecosystems, as we see here. This is basically a moisture gradient. The Rocky Mountains out here provide an effect to cause a rain shadow, which means that there's less moisture the further west you go. And you've certainly seen that anytime you've driven out towards the west, out to the Rocky Mountains. It's a gradient, that, again, about 10 or less inches of rain out here, 10 to 20 or so inches through the center part here where the mixed prairie is, and of course, in our neck of the woods over here, the Tallgrass Prairie, we get anywhere from 30 to 40 inches of rain. So the focus, of course, will be on the Tallgrass Prairie tonight, and we can look at a little bit better map of just the Tallgrass Prairie and see that now Iowa sits right smack dab in the center there, and we arguably, I think, could claim to be in the heart of Tallgrass Prairie and perhaps have, at least originally, back in the old days when prairie was still here, perhaps the most grand and the most diverse and the most diverse kinds of prairie. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But see, it does stretch all the way from Canada, all the way down to the Gulf Coast. The scattered remnants that we see along the eastern margin here kind of represent times when previously, from about 8,000 to about 5,000 years ago, during a really, really warm period of time called the hypsothermal, prairie actually extended, the Tallgrass Prairie extended out into this area here, and since then has shrunk back because of the change from a really hot and dry time, again, during that hypsothermal period, to cooler and more moist times. And you can see little remnants and scraps of prairie again in some of these other states here. But again, this is really where the heart of the Tallgrass Prairie is, right here. And this is a t-shirt that I actually designed a long, long time ago when I was a student at Iowa State, a grad student, and the Ecological Society of America was coming to Iowa for a meeting. But yeah, it was again kind of promoting again Iowa's central location in Iowa State, of course, in the center of the Tallgrass Prairie. And again, I want to emphasize how important that is in terms of giving Iowa a great diversity of different kinds of prairie and different kinds of prairie plants. And that's going to be kind of one of the themes here. If we go back to what Iowa was originally, the best evidence that we can kind of scrape together about what Iowa looked like, maybe 1846 or so when Iowa became a state, we can do it a couple different ways. We can look at government land office surveys. These are surveys done by the land surveyors roughly from 1832 to 1850 or so, when they were mapping out the section lines all across the state. as they did that, they were asked to provide written reports on what the vegetation, what the landscape looked like. And so we can get a look back in history by reading this information the land surveyors have compiled. Now it's a lot of information with a lot of different surveyors, a lot of different notes, a lot of different people doing it. And so a while back, Paul Anderson, landscape architecture professor at Iowa State, took it upon himself and his students to take a look at all of those land surveyor notes and try to make sense of them. And basically what he did was he came up with this map. He showed, basically took the notes and divided the descriptions that the land surveyors made into basically 4 different types of plant community. The tan here is prairie. The green, different types of, again, the notes that the land surveyors made. Green represents forest. The really light green represents savanna. And then this aqua blue represents some type of wetland or lake or stream. Now, you can't see these very well here, so if I'll put this up. This shows, again, all the different ways in which the land surveyors describe the landscape. And so his job was trying to make sense of, well, what was the land surveyor seeing, and what do I think he meant when he described an area as an oak barren or as a scattering of trees? Well, again, what he's saying is he thinks those descriptions there probably were examples of savanna. If they describe the landscape as a meadow or prairie, that's pretty clear what that was. Any of these descriptions here, note that they never actually used the term forest for some reason, but all of these descriptions here, they decided were probably forest, and of course all of those over there are wetland or aquatic. If you look at the amount of acres then, you can see here the percent prairie, about 80% there, savanna 6.3%. We can combine prairie and savanna since they are so similar. Savanna is really just prairie with large scattered trees, usually oaks. We get about 87% of the state was savanna or prairie. I mean, so obviously we know that prairie is a really significant part of our heritage. And we can see that, again, by looking at the soils. If you look at the soils, this is a compilation of what the soils say about the historic landscapes. Soil scientists are able to characterize soils and look at their formation and deduce what kind of vegetation they formed under, at least what was the vegetation present, most likely to be present, during the formation of soils over hundreds of years. And by looking at the soils again and looking at what the presumed vegetation was, we end up with this data right here. And you note that it's pretty remarkably close to what the land surveyors say. So 2 independent versions of trying to get at the question of how much prairie was there here, roughly 86–87% seems to be pretty close. I think probably, in my view, there's probably maybe a little bit more savanna than what we see there. Again, but it would all depend upon, again, how a person is seeing the landscape and whether they think there's enough trees there to call it that. But we know, again, that, so let's say 85 is the number that I hear often used. Certainly seems about right. 85% of the state was prairie. Maybe you've heard, anyone know how much prairie is left? Of that 85% of the state being prairie, how much we have left, roughly? Less than what? Less than 2%, yeah? Anyone get a little bit closer?
1/10 of 1.
1/10 of 1%, right. Approximately 1/10 of 1%. So if you think about that in terms of roughly 30 million acres, the 85% would be roughly 30 million acres of prairie on the landscape. We have 1/10 of 1% is 30,000 acres. So, and that 30,000 acres, of course, is not all in one place. That 30,000 acres is splintered into hundreds of smaller pieces. We should be happy we have some, of course. Agriculture was destined to change the landscape in Iowa, and it certainly did. Wish we had a little bit more, but we do have at least what we have, and it's most of it is in pretty good shape, I think. If you look at what causes the prairie to be different, and that's, again, one of the themes I want to kind of stress tonight is, and it was mentioned in the introduction, because I provided that, I produced this little graph right here to help explain how why prairie looks different. Why you might go to some prairies and there's some species here, go to a different prairie and there's different species over there. The idea that in prairie communities there's a lot of different kinds of prairie. And that's again an important concept that to get across to the public, because again a lot of times people think, well, forest is forest, prairie is prairie, wetland is wetland. But in each case there are lots of different kinds of each of those. And the same, again, that rings true certainly for prairies. The reason there's lots of different kinds of prairie is because there's mainly three important gradients at play here. This is a three-dimensional box. And each of the dimensions of the box represent one of these important factors. I would say the most important factor is this one I just highlighted here, the one that looks at a gradient of soil moisture and fertility from wet, high fertility types of soil to dry and low fertility types of sites. And that gradient, again, drives where species are found, what kinds of species you're going to see. That gradient can be enforced by all of these factors. All of these factors, the thickness of the soil, the texture of the soil, relative elevation, what direction the slope is facing that you might be standing on, and a large-scale climate factor from southeast Iowa, which again is wetter, to northwest Iowa, which is drier. So all of these different things here can interact and play out on the landscape to create this important gradient here that affects where species are found. Another dimension of this box is this one called environmental perturbation or disturbance. So this is something that happens usually by the organisms that live in the community, aside from fire. But soil disturbance and herbivores, again, that's some type of stress that's put onto plants because of the species that are living there, digging up the soil or eating the plants. Fire, of course, is something that is a manifestation of the climate, so it's more of a physical factor, but it has an important connection to the amount of vegetation that's present because that provides the fuel to create the fire in the first place. So fire, badgers, bison, gophers, prairie dogs that create soil disturbance, herbivores all the way from bison and elk, the large macro herbivores to the small micro herbivores, the grasshoppers and insects. They all, again, can create stress. Enough stress causes a perturbation, can kind of change the species a little bit because stressed out plants don't compete as well. Maybe other plants that are better able to compete can kind of come in. And if the stress is great enough, if it's significant enough, it can kill plants or remove plants from a patch, for example. That's what happens when a badger digs after a ground squirrel and basically kills the plants where it's digging. It's creating a bare patch of soil. Those are called disturbances. So then those disturbances, again, create opportunities for other plants to come in and colonize the site. So that, again, can help to change what the plant species composition is. And finally, the third dimension on this three-dimensional box is the one that's associated with Distributive Biogeography. And biogeography means that all species, animals and plants, have a natural native range where populations of those species can be found. It's due to where did they evolve? Where did that species come into existence? And then how well have they been able to enlarge their range? Have there been barriers that prevented them from moving places like mountains or rivers or oceans? Have there, what happens during glacial periods when ice comes down and pushes species away? How well do they come back into these areas? So again, every species has a particular range. I'm going to show you some examples of those with some of the prairie forbs. Again, we can kind of look at that with respect to there's some species that you're going to find in northern Iowa because their biogeographical range includes the northern part of the Midwest. Other species we wouldn't expect to see up there because we only see them in the southern part of the state, or likewise east to west. So all of these factors can have an effect on, again, what species are going to be present in a community. And a community is a group of species that are living together in a space and time, and that would then push the community that would position the community someplace in this three-dimensional box. I've got a little dot right there, sort of right in the middle of the box. But again, this is a three-dimensional box, and so the combination of all three of these gradients would move prairie communities around in this three-dimensional space. All right, that's what affects where species are found. Now, how many forbs and grasses and woody plants, might we expect to see in a prairie? This is from the Tallgrass Prairie Restoration Handbook. Doug Ladd, who's with the Nature Conservancy in Missouri, put together an appendix, which he went through and just tried to list all of the vascular plants that you might find in a Midwestern tallgrass prairie. It would include, of course, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, on down to the Gulf Coast. And you can see he came up with nearly 1,000 plant species. That's one reason, again, why prairies are so diverse. I think it's pretty fair to say that the prairie ecosystem, the prairie communities, have the most diversity of any ecosystem on Earth if you just look at the herbaceous layer. Now, tropical rainforests beat us out when you look at a large chunk of land, like a square mile or something like that, a large piece of landscape, because it has so many different species of trees. But if you're looking at just a square meter, or let's say just even 2 or 3 square meters of herbaceous layer on the ground, the tallgrass prairie will beat out the tropical rainforest. Nearly 1,000 species. Of those nearly 1,000 species, 71% are forbs. And you can kind of see the breakdown here, of course, of different kinds. Annual means that they just live for 1 year, biennial for 2 years, perennial for 3 or more years. Pteridophytes are those plants that we describe as ferns or horsetails. Grasses, only 22%. And woody plants, down here at the bottom, about 6.6%. Now, we don't expect many woody plants on a prairie because of the role of fire. Most woody plants don't get along with fire very well. So again, what we see here is that, when we look at all of the plants, there is a huge bias towards forbs. That the diversity, the richness, and the different kinds of plants we're going to see on a prairie mainly is because of the forbs. So again, hence sort of the focus tonight on those, the floral jewels, the forbs. Here's a list of the most diverse families on prairie. This gives a scientific name, so I'll go through them and give you the common names. Clear at the top of the list, clearly almost every time you look at a prairie, is the sunflower family, or daisy. Poaceae is the grass family. They're close to the top, even though, again, overall they don't have a huge number in the total flora of the prairie. A given prairie usually has quite a few different grasses. This is the legumes, or the pea family. This is a family that includes all those things we call sedges, sedges, spike rushes, bulrushes, a lot of plants that tend to live a little bit more in wetter environments. This is the milkweeds. These are the buttercups, mints, roses, the spurge family, the mustard family, evening primrose, figwort, and vervain. These are families that you should see species in if you go out and look at a prairie. So let's look again at this grass forb thing, because again, grass is only about 22%. If you look at the grasses on a prairie, what they're doing out there primarily is providing a lot of productivity. They produce a lot of biomass. These are 4 species we certainly see on most of our prairies. This one's a little more southern. This is eastern gamma grass, this is switchgrass, big blue stem, and Indian grass. These are the tall grasses, the namesake of the Tallgrass Prairie. But again, what these grasses are kind of doing functionally is providing a lot of growth that a lot of the macro herbivores, those elk and bison, would have consumed. We wouldn't have elk and bison using prairie if it weren't for the grasses, because that's what they mainly eat. Grasses also provide a lot of what we call fine fuel. The fine fuel is that their leaves are really fine and slender. When the leaves dry out, provides a fuel that's very easy to ignite. And so grasses really form the basis of getting a fire to work through the prairie. If you don't have very many grasses, if you're doing a reconstruction, don't have many grasses in your prairie, you're going to have a hard time getting it to burn. These last two I put up are a couple of the mid-grasses, cytostem and little blue stem. All the pictures that have a border around them are photographs I've taken. This is the only one I think that doesn't, because I couldn't find a really good little blue stem photo that I have. And then there's a couple more of cool season grasses. So again, all of these here are warm season grasses. They predominate during the warmer months of summer. But the prairie does have a good selection of cool season grasses. These are grasses that begin growth earlier in the growing season, early summer, and actually flower by June or so, June grass and porcupine grass. So again, they have an important role to play in the prairie. As I said, productivity, feeding the larger herbivores, providing a basis for fire. They provide a lot of habitat structure too, of course, cover, if they don't get eaten or burned, for birds that want to nest in the prairie, for example. But it is the forbs that provide the greatest richness of plant life, as we just saw, with 70% of the prairie species likely to be forbs. And they provide a huge range of phenology, which is timing of when they are growing. The grasses are more confined to pretty much from May to early September. Past flowers are going to be blooming in a few weeks. First thing on the prairie to bloom. To the gentians that are still blooming perhaps in October. So the forbs are providing this much greater length of growing season and activity, which of course is important for all the insects and all the other critters out there in the prairie that depend on the plants for food. You have forbs that are pretty common on prairies and have really important functions, like the prairie clovers, which of course fix nitrogen and help to put fertility into the soils. Other plants like Vascular toadflax have important ecological relationships. This is a plant that is a hemiparasite. It's photosynthetic, as you can see with the green leaves. It's got chlorophyll. It can do photosynthesis, but it also has specialized root systems that grow into the usually grasses, the roots of adjacent plants, again mainly a grass, and parasitize those plants by growing these specialized roots into the roots and getting into the phloem tissue of those grasses and taking some of the sugars. That's an important effect on the prairie, because that helps to suppress some of the grass growth and again helps to reduce the competitiveness of the grasses. You look at a prairie as sort of one way of looking at it is sort of the grasses against the forbs in one way. The grasses tend to be pretty competitive. A lot of them are, again, the warm season grasses are more so that way. So anything that can help to stress and slow the grasses down a little bit, and herbivory would be one of those things. That's why it's important to have bison and elk out on the prairie, or these semi-parasitic plants, again, are going to help to increase the opportunities for other forbs. This is prairie smoke, something that, again, is found mainly up in the northeastern part of the state or along the northern counties. This is a biscuit root. This is a state-listed endangered species found only in the Lusk Hills. So again, with the forbs, you're going to get a lot more importance of biogeography. Most of all those grasses, except for mainly the eastern gamma grass, which is mainly southern Iowa. Most of those grasses occur all across the state. But with the forbs, most of them occur only in certain parts of the state. And that's what's going to then create sort of uniqueness, makes each prairie, no matter what part of the state you're in, helps to add a sort of distinctive touch to each of those sites. Because again, it's the forbs that have more restrictiveness in terms of where they're found. This one again is found only in the Loess Hills. Kittentails is an northeastern Iowa species and a little bit more in savannas. And this one is Death Camas, a very poisonous plant, and is mainly across the northern part of the state in kind of limestone or drier sites. So this is just a quick look at again, some of the ways in which forbs sort of add their own particular flavor. We're going to take a look now at the state and again try to get this idea of why there's so many different kinds of prairie within the state. And I start by looking at the landforms. Again, we have pretty diverse landforms, although a lot of people would argue, it's pretty boring because most of Iowa is pretty flat, and people don't come here to see our landscape very much. But for those of us who live here and know the landscape, we know that all these different landscape forms, landform regions have their own particular, of course, geological history, just the geology that has made them different. So that's an important thing. It makes different kinds of soils, creates different kinds of conditions in the environment. Climatic variation, again, mainly from northwest to southeast is an important variable. And again, this central position in the tallgrass prairie ecosystem within the grassland biome allows for more sort of a infusion of species from all across the biome. Creates, again, this regional diversity in prairie that we see in the state. So again, we sit here in the Des Moines lobe, here at Ames, the southern part of it right here. Some portions of the Des Moines lobe have really gravelly and dry, porous soils if you're sitting on a gravel moraine. Other places, really deep, fertile black soil, of course. Other places where there's poor drainage and things are really wet. So there's quite a bit of, even though it's pretty flat, yes, there's quite a bit of diversity even in the lobe by itself, different kinds of prairie. Go to the island surface, and it's an undulating, more of a kind of a soft, hilly kind of landscape. A lot of deep black soil over there. Some presence of fens, which are special kinds of wetlands. Get up into the Paleozoic plateau, and you've got, of course, really steep slopes, a lot of bedrock, really thin soils, really dry, stressful kinds of environments. Going to create a different kind of environment for prairie there. Along the many of the river systems in eastern Iowa, there's aeolian sand deposits. Wind has taken sand from the river valleys and blown sand dunes up on adjacent landscapes and create sand prairie then, of course. And sand prairie, of course, is again going to create dry and very low for fertility types of environments. Get into southern Iowa and the southern Iowa drift plains. This is a very old landscape. It hasn't been glaciated for over 500,000 years, so the landscape is very old, aside from a layer of loess that was deposited on it, which does help to give it some fertility. There is still a lot of places where these very ancient soils, that's a term for a really old soil. These paleosol exposures are places where the fertility is really low, there's lots of clay, creates a stressful environment for plants. Rolling, well-drained hills, different kinds of slopes. Get into the Missouri River floodplain, very poor drainage, of course, there. The Loess Hills have very steep slopes with lots of different aspects and really xeric conditions, xeric meaning very, very dry, sort of mimicking the conditions you would find out into the Great Plains, a couple hundred miles to the west. And get into the northwest Iowa, the river valleys like the Little Sioux River. We can see, again, slopes causing drainage, causing different slope directions and gravel exposures, creating different kinds of environments for plants. And finally, way up in the very northwest corner, Gitche Manitou, bedrock exposure up there with the Sioux quartzite, 1.6 billion years old or so. Again, a very stressful environment and very dry environment too, because they only get about 28 inches of rain here as opposed to about 40 down here. Let's take a quick look around the state at some of the forbs then that we would see in these places. This will kind of just be a quick run through on the Luss Hills, get a kind of a picture of what the landform looks like. Showy goldenrod there and the longhorn grasshopper with great flowering beard tongue, a real common plant out there, again more of a western species. 3.5 Kettlehole up in northwest Iowa, Dickinson County, a Moreno type of deposit there. Western coneflower here with a little crab spider and purple local weed. Jumping over to east central Iowa, actually in Marshall County, Marietta Sand Prairie. So this is a sand deposit from the Iowa River. Evening primrose, common evening primrose shown there, and flowering spurge. Jumping over to Calhoun County, west central Iowa sort of, Castle Prairie. This is a black soil mesic prairie, wet mesic prairie, part of a prairie blazing star there. Golden Alexanders, and butterfly milkweed. Going up a little bit further to the north and west, up into Cherokee County, Steel Prairie State Preserve, Canada anemone here, and prairie vetchling, a legume. Up into northeast Iowa, we're just kind of hopping all over the place there. Up in Clayton County, there's this area called Cleve Prairie and Fen. It's got a fen on it, but there's wet, sort of wet mesic prairie that surrounds it. The obedient plant shown here, and blue flag shown there. Well, up in northeast Iowa, then on those hill prairies, those really steep limestone prairies, bedrock exposure, limestone boulders and such, where there's very thin soil. Birdfoot violet, silky aster. Way up there in northwest Iowa, Gitche Manitou, that site I said that was the borders of the preserve are actually Minnesota and South Dakota. This is fragile prickly pear. It's a state endangered species. This is the hairy false golden aster, pretty much only found up there in that part of the state. And here's a wild prairie rose in the fall with the rose hips and fall coloration in the leaves. Down in southeast Iowa, big deposit of sand called Big Sand Mound. This is goat's rue, real common species in sand prairies. This is dotted bergamot and sand cocoon. These are all sand prairie species. And down in southern Iowa in Adair County, this is a privately owned prairie. Couple of federally endangered species. That's the highest level of endangerment that can be for a plant. Mead's milkweed and the western prairie fringed orchid are both found there. So that's a quick look at around the state of, again, the kinds of forbs and the differences in prairie because, again, of the forbs having their own unique biogeography, only occurring in certain parts of the state. Now we'll come home to Story County and we'll look more closely at Doolittle Prairie. How many of you been there? Good, most of you, at least. If you haven't been there, I probably should announce that starting in May and running from May, June, July, and August, sponsored by Story County Conservation, I lead prairie walks out there. It's the fourth Thursday of the month, so just look at the fourth Thursday of the month, and it'll be at 7 p.m. We start in the parking lot there, meet in the parking lot in Doolittle Prairie, and spend an hour and a half or so. Sometimes it drags out to about 9 o'clock, and take a look at what's going on in the prairie. Lloyd Krim led those walks for like 26 years or so, and I just sort of kind of started taking over from his long track record there, and we'll be doing that again this year. So, Doolittle is just a little ways south of Story City, a couple miles south of Story City, right here. And here's a kind of quick map of the preserve right here. This is the state preserve. The state preserve is 26 acres in size. It was purchased from the grandchildren of William Doolittle. In 1979, William Doolittle homesteaded this area in 1855, and the Doolittle family maintained ownership of that land all through the years. The grandchildren again decided that after haying this for the northern part of this for years and years and years, and not really being able to do too much with the southern part here, that maybe it was time to honor their grandfather and make sure that this prairie was saved forever. And it gets sold to the Iowa DNR and was dedicated as a state preserve in 1980. Story County Conservation does the management there. Well, it does sit on, of course, the Des Moines lobe, so it has this, again, what we call the prairie pothole features. The Des Moines lobe is largely prairie pothole. It's a kind of a undulating, slightly swell and swale type of topography where low areas, fill in with water, those become potholes, and the slightly higher areas, which may not be much more than just 2 or 3 feet higher than the low areas, tend to be more of a mesic or a wet mesic kind of prairie. I was just telling someone on the way in, I noticed that now because of all the snow melt and the rain, you can really see where those potholes are right now. They're filling in with water, so partly because, of course, the ground probably still froze up. The north part up here is about 15 acres. The south part is divided into 2 parts, and we'll see that in just a little bit and talk more about that. The north part is really the best part right up in here, and that's where we focus most of the time when we check our hikes out there. The entire preserve is said to have 14 potholes. I'll point out that I've only really found 13 on the maps, but we'll see. This area down here was owned by the Doolittles as well, but this is now owned by Story County Conservation. It's not a part of the preserve, but they've done some restoration work there. I think maybe they've planted some seed there as well. And this is still owned by the Doolittle family here. So you can see this all was prairie. Well, of course, this was all prairie through here, of course, but the Doolittle family had more or less protected most of this. And they still own this, and I'm not sure if they just hay that. Does anyone know? I think maybe they still hay it, but they still own it. I put this little pothole in here because I wanted to show you that if you go back and, well, here's a 1930s era photo with the same boundaries. So again, and this shows again, this is being hayed up here. This is being row cropped here. So you can see how that looks a little bit different. This is being hayed up here. They did try to do some farming, and in the 1960s or so, they tried to plow some of this southern part down in here, but abandoned that approach and went back to just using it for hay. So I'm pointing out this little pothole here because I'm going to jump to the south now and show you that, again, in 1930, there's a big chunk of prairie down here even. Another probably 30 acres or so of prairie existed down here in 1930, 1940, 1950, it was still there. It got plowed up and converted to agriculture in the 1960s. But again, this is still owned by the family and still has at least a degraded prairie. Here's some work that was done by some folks from Iowa State, Paul Wetzel, Bill Norris, Kevin Lyles. In 1999, they published a paper that looked at combined work that they did in the 1990s doing floristic inventories on the prairie with some work that was done by an undergrad student by the name of Woodley back in 1983 or so. And they kind of combined the work of both of those folks and then also some other people who had done some collection, just looking at the herbarium at Iowa State to see what plants had been collected there. And they came up with this composition for Doolittle Prairie State Preserve, just looking again at the 26 acres, that's the actual state preserve. Roughly 220 native species just in 26 acres. And half of that's degraded. So most of those are in 220 species in roughly 15 acres. So again, you can imagine the number of species that could be present on a square mile. A whole square mile of actual nice prairie would be far more than that. Here's again, we can see those top 5 families here in the prairie at Doolittle. Those were, of course, all among the families that I pointed out before. This shows the genera that have the most species, and these are the sedges with 19 different species of sedges, 4 different species of smartweed, 5 different milkweeds, 5 different asters, 3 different thistles, is what that shows us there. And they put this little diagram in. They basically looked at the prairie and said there's about 5 different kinds of communities out here, 5 different plant communities. The low prairie comprises sort of the matrix of the site. I would also call that the a wet mesic tallgrass prairie. 104 species can be found there according to their work. The size of the circle kind of represents the number of species that were found or observed in these different kinds of plant communities. The amount of white space there, it says the proportion of species exclusive to a community is left white. So that's about 40% of the species are only found there. And of course, this is a lot smaller amount here. This is over 75%. Over 75% of the species are only found in this disturbed area here. Lots of those are non-native, weedy things. So again, and then the connection here, the lines connect, show how many species basically can be found in both. So again, this means that there's a fair number of species that can be found in both the wet mesic tallgrass prairie or the wet meadow, which I would also call a sedge meadow or a temporary flooded wetland. I'm just going to put the rest of these up. The shallow emergent is the wettest portions. Those are the deepest portions of the potholes where there's the most chance for standing water. A seasonal flooded wetland is what SFW means. And then the disturbed prairie is that southern portion of the preserve that again was partially plowed. They tried to do a little bit more agriculture there. I would call it, in parts of it are degraded wet mesic tallgrass prairie, and other parts have really just been converted to brome and bluegrass, exotic cool season grassland and forbs, with lots of non-native species in it. And then this last category again, or last community, is kind of a combination of the fence row areas that are kind of disturbed, the reconstructed prairie along the lane, early successional habitats around the parking lot, places again where there's a lot of cool season grass, the non-native cool season grasses like brome and Kentucky bluegrass. So again, these are the 5 different community types that they recognized in their paper. This is an aerial photo of Doolittle Prairie and just the preserve now in 1990s. So that's at the time when they were doing this work. And you can see that again, all these fence rows, well, that fence row and this fence row, and there was a fence through here that divided the north half from the south half, had a lot of shrubs. That was the dogwood shrubland that they described. Again, this is the wet mesic tallgrass prairie, the higher quality area that was just hayed. It was used for prairie hay for the most part, which again doesn't really degrade a prairie that much. It can have an effect, of course, but it's not nearly as bad, of course, as plowing. This is the degraded area down here where there was some attempt to plow over in this portion here. A lot more non-native invasive kinds of species down on this side. The wetlands, you can kind of see fairly good here, but some aerial photos don't show the wetlands really very well. We went through the aerial photos and we found this one from about 2007. The wetlands really stand out there. So I went through and put these circles around all the wetland areas, all the potholes. And the potholes, they really are both of these other 2 communities. The deepest portions are the shallow emergent, if it's deep enough to get enough water to be that. And then the perimeter of those deeper basins is the sedge meadow. So both of those communities would be present in at least some of these. The sedge meadow would be present in those that don't really have enough depth to their basin to hold that much water. They said there's 4 wetlands here. I think maybe that one, maybe that one are deep enough that they hold substantial amounts of water into the growing season, into late summer in most years. And they're going to have then the shallow emergent. So if you put all these together, I put these all together then on the 1990s aerial photo, and then put those all together on a 2017 aerial photo. This is an aerial photo from 2017. They have been doing a lot of work to remove the shrubs. So there's still shrubby areas here, there's some shrubby stuff here, but this shrubby area in through here is not really so shrubby now. They've made some progress in removing, when I say they, Story County has made some progress in kind of knocking some of that back, taking that out. But there's still some shrubby stuff that's still a problem here. There's always going to be a problem, of course, with shrub invasion. So that's what it looks like more or less now. Now let's take a look at some of the species. We'll kind of wrap up then with a quick look at some of those species you can find at Doolittle Prairie. Many of those other ones I showed you earlier, you can also find at Doolittle Prairie too. These are all species that do occur there. This is wood betony. And I'm showing a map that shows the distribution of each of these species. Some of these maps come from this book here by Paul Christensen and Mark Mueller. And it's helpful to have these maps because what Paul Christensen did was he went into the herbaria across the state and looked at actual vouchers, where a voucher is a plant that's been collected and there's information about where and when it was obtained. And by looking at primarily more historic records, I'm not sure what date he might have used, but say prior to 1970 at least, that sort of helps to give us a better picture of what the native range was, where the plant was natively on the landscape. When we look at ranges now, or information like this now, we have to be cognizant of the fact that a lot of people have planted prairie species all over the place. And a lot of times those species get, unfortunately, planted outside of their biogeographical range. And so those wouldn't, looking at that kind of information wouldn't give us a true picture. But these do, I think, give us a pretty good true picture of where each of these species was on the native landscape. And of course, some counties not having a dot doesn't mean that necessarily it's not there. It just means that there isn't a voucher. No one has collected it from that county. This sort of implies to me that this species was pretty much found throughout the entire state. And it's found mainly in the wet music tallgrass prairie. Again, that matrix of prairie out there that is the, is the driest part of the landscape there. Here's a real common one out there, rattlesnake master. Again, it's a inhabitant of that wet music tallgrass prairie, the most fertile soil there. Here's one that I put some little notes here because this was doesn't have any voucher for it. It was supposedly observed by somebody else. It wasn't observed by any of those people on the paper. There's an observation of it. I've not seen wild licorice out there. It certainly could be. It does occur in Story County, certainly. But this is a record that's a little bit not clear as to whether it's correct or not. Purple meadow rue. This is one that does occur pretty well down into that degraded southern portion of the preserve. And of course, prairie blazing star. It's a pretty common one out there. And again, it's a pretty common one statewide, except you don't see it really in the Luss Hills. Prairie violet. Another one that does do okay on the degraded prairie. Naughty Lady's Tress and orchid. Now here we're starting to see maybe a pattern where you might say, well, it looks like this has a range that pretty much doesn't include the western fourth of Iowa. I don't know about that record right there. Could check into it. This is a species that's not easy to identify. It's got some other species that look like it. So that would always be one thing to check. Check that record there and see if it's correctly identified. Prairie cinquefoil. This is a real common milkweed out on the prairie. Again, it grows in both the north and south halves. Sullivan's milkweed. Now, these maps show a different source for range. This is BONAP. This is an online website that shows, it's based on herbarium data, but it's also based on just any kinds of records that the organizer, the maker of the website kind of can come up with. It can be based on reports or just something written down perhaps about where a species is found or what county it's found in. This is not as reliable as a way of looking at the native range because it can include records that come into the system last month. So 2015 records of something found somewhere, which again could be a consequence of someone planting the species and not necessarily showing what the actual native range was. So unfortunately we have to use BONAP in some cases because the ranges given by Paul Christensen in that book I was showing you previously only are just a few of the prairie species. Again, he's not covering all 400 or 500 prairie species. So smartweed is obviously a wetland species. It's in the emergent wetlands and in that sedge meadow area. And it occurs everywhere in the state, of course, as you can see there for the most part. Another wetland species, but not nearly as common throughout the entire state, is the northern water plantain. This photograph was actually made out there at the prairie. And really getting into some of the harder species to kind of find out there. This is one that you really do have to have a fairly wet year in order to see it there. The common bladderwort. This is a carnivorous plant too. I can't really show you. I don't have a picture of the leaves, but the leaves are below the water, so it's hard to get a picture of them. They're submerged. But they have little bladders on them, little structures that function in capturing little zooplankton and other little invertebrates that are swimming down in the water. So it actually eats things as well as makes its own food. Again, you would find those in the wettest areas, those 4 wetlands there that have standing water for the longest period of time. This is another wet meadow species that's pretty unusual, but you can see it's again mainly a northeastern half of Iowa. Another wetland species, a submergent species, the water buttercup here. And you can see its leaves right here. Its leaves too are submerged in the water, do not come above the water. Clearly again, a line right there showing that this is a species that's found in this part of the state. It's not found down here at all. That's its biogeography. Marsh cress, real common, a disturbance species, does well in disturbed wetland areas, somewhat exposed mud areas. This is one we see a lot at the Distributive Prairie, the prairie loosestrife. And water hemlock. Notice that story does not have a dot in it, so that just simply means that no one's made a collection from Story County. I mean, this is in Story County, so there should be a dot there, but again, you have to realize these maps are showing what the herbarium says, and it's very possible, of course, in many cases, not to have a record for each county. Wing loosestrife. Here's another record that I doubt. This is Hill's thistle. This is a state endangered species. This is a record that student, undergrad student Greg Woodley, came up with in 1983. And I asked Bill if there is a voucher for it, I guess, and I don't know if he's checked it, but I think that should be checked. It could be, it's possible, but it's a species that you generally find in drier environments, but needs to be checked probably. there's about 4 or 5 species that, well, actually there's 5 species that Greg Woodley has in his paper that he found in Distributive Prairie that no one else has seen. The stonecrop is a wetland species, in wet meadows, as you can see there. And finally, Virginia mountain mint. Really, again, real common species out there at Distributive Prairie. You'll recognize it right away as soon as you start walking through the prairie and you start to disturb the mountain mint and you start releasing some of those oils. You get that minty smell. Oops, wrong way, sorry. So, if you want to learn more about forbs and grasses and have a guidebook that can be helpful in exploring Iowa's prairies and even some of the prairies in some of the adjacent states, here's a book to consider. This is a book by Sylvan Runkle and Dean Russa. Sylvan Runkle is a naturalist and soil conservationist for many years, well known among most folks that know anything about conservation in Iowa. And Dean Russa was a former ecologist with the DNR and was a consulting ecologist for many years. They teamed up to produce a couple of books, this one and then a book on the wetlands of Iowa as well. And then Sylvan and another guy, Alfred Bull, wrote and did a similar book on woodlands and forests. So there's actually 3 of these books, one for each of those different types of plant systems. This is a 2nd edition. It's a revision of this book here. So this is a much older version. This is a much newer version, has updated photographs, has some updated nomenclature, so the taxonomy, the species, the scientific names of the species have been updated to what they currently are. And yeah, that'd be a good investment if you're going to be spending some time on prairie. And that's all I've got. So thanks again for coming and listening, and I hope it didn't go too long or anything, but questions? Yeah, I have some time for some questions if you wish. Yeah?
So if humanity was, to take off and go to Mars, leaving Iowa, vacant,
Yep.
what would actually happen to all that farmland? Do you restore the prairie, or become sort of some weird hybrid mix?
Yeah.
What?
That's so the question is, what would happen? This is a question that I got a phone call 8 years ago. I actually heard about this part of the phone call. It was National Geographic, I think, was behind this or something like that. And they were playing out this scenario. It's kind of an interesting thought experiment. What would happen to our landscapes and our natural areas, or whatever, our ag areas and natural areas, if all of a sudden humans are just gone? So, if we disappeared, what would happen? And so I had kind of a long discussion with this guy on the phone about that. And so I have thought about that a little bit. It's been a while. My argument or my point was that, well, of course, you have to think about what would happen when humans are gone. There's not going to be any more, cleaning or keeping things up. So a lot of things are going to fall into disrepair, of course. You're going to get a lot of ruderal species because we have so many non-native invasive ruderal species. These are species that colonize disturbances, the species that grow in the cracks of sidewalks. So in our towns, you're going to start getting all kinds of those species. Out in our agricultural landscapes, you're going to have a lot of those species too. There's going to be a vast amount of weedy species that are going to come in now in those croplands because there's no one tending the fields anymore. There's no one applying herbicide. There's no one cultivating or disking those areas. And those seed banks, the species, the plant species that are residing below ground in the soil have viable seeds, living baby plants are down there in the soil waiting for an opportunity to grow. There's a lot of work done on seed banks. I've done a lot of work, and although there's of course, a massive amount of herbicides applied to farm fields to kill weeds, there's still a lot of weed seed out there in the soil seed bank, especially from adjacent areas. So what I would expect is you're going to get most of those fields are going to become just weedy fields of early successional species. The question then happens, well, what happens over time? Because those usually are, that's the first stage of succession to have those early colonizing species to come in. There's certainly places across the landscape where there are native plants, remnants, and reconstructed prairies. So, and this is where it gets difficult to try to think about, well, to what extent are those, what kind of success are those species going to have in moving off of those areas and taking over, or maybe, you know, battling out with the non-native species on those ag fields. I think in order for that to happen, if there was the same factors that created prairie millions of years ago and helped to maintain prairie for millions of years and have affected prairie for thousands of years, fire, herbivory, drought, those are the three main things that really were in force to create the central North American grassland biome. If some of those factors start coming into play, then I could see that there could be sort of a natural tendency for the prairie to kind of start making its way back from these seed sources that are still present. You'd have to have, you have to have fire, I think, and you'd have to have dryness, dry times when fire is going to be even burn even more. But it's such a new system. It's so different, though, from the way that prairie evolved, because now we've got all these non-native, rural, early successional weedy species that weren't here back when prairie was evolving. So that's where it gets almost impossible, I think, to figure out, well, that's going to change things, though, because it's a novel landscape now. It's a landscape that's not natural. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is. We can always hope that it would be a resurgence of prairie somehow, but I'm not so sure. It might take an ice age to actually do that. And that should happen too, because if ice age comes in, all that gets destroyed. And we go back to ground zero, like the last one. And prairie did fine after that. So, yeah, good question though. Mike?
Two things. Seems to be a push for carbon sequestration and the planting of trees. And what are your thoughts on let's put in more prairies, and then how does that help the health of the soil, the root structure?
Yeah, I'm not a climate scientist. I don't study this, but just what I know and understand about prairies, of course, and forests and climate and carbon, the carbon cycle and so forth. I think there's a good argument that, yes, we should be thinking about that more so as a way to make the possibility for reducing carbon dioxide inputs, to take carbon out of the air, make it something that's more commonly done and more widespread. I was just at a talk last night at Grinnell. John Norris was there talking about CAFOs and the problems that CAFOs provide for us, of course, in our landscapes, and he was kind of talking about some policies he thinks that would be important to get back to more of a sustainable agricultural method, which of course involves CAFOs, but also involves the way farming is done. And he was suggesting that we have some kind of system where farmers can get a carbon credit, basically. If they're farming more sustainably and building the soil by their sustainable agricultural practices, actually building the soil, it means they're putting carbon into the soil, building organic matter. They should be rewarded. That should be like a part of the farm program. The farm program has notoriously been focused on helping farmers do the wrong thing. We should have a program that focuses on farmers doing sustainable things, and he was suggesting that as a way to, again, help reduce the amount of carbon that's going into the air, getting some of that carbon out of the air, and getting down to our 2050 goals, of not having any more CO2 going into the air. And I think, from an ecological standpoint, I think there's, again, I don't know a lot about it, but both will do the same thing. When the trees are growing, they're putting carbon into wood. And so they are taking carbon out of the air and putting it into wood. The problem is, a little bit there is that that only really works with young, fast-growing trees, really. And once a tree has matured and isn't really adding any more wood, or very little wood, because it's really not growing anymore, not growing in size anymore, I mean, then it's not acting as a carbon sink, really. You know, it's producing leaves, but the leaves come off and we're going to return carbon to the air. So, you know, you might argue there's a little bit of a limit to what trees and forests can do. You know, they're going to do good in the beginning, and you get the quickest response by having fast-growing trees. But then, of course, the fast-growing trees don't live very long, and so you have to keep planting them, I guess, and cutting them down and use them some way that doesn't involve returning carbon to the air, you know, I guess somehow. Whereas in the soil, I mean, I don't know if there's any limit, but you can just keep putting carbon into the soil. You know, organic matter can just keep going up and up and up. And so it seems like there might be an argument that the soil can be, and I think there's actually some research that points this out, but again, I don't study that area directly, that is the case, that you could get, in terms of the tons of carbon. I mean, soil's everywhere, you know, and that's another point, except desert soils aren't going to do that very well, but any place you've got a reasonably fertile soil and reasonable amount of moisture, yeah, having their soil be a reservoir for carbon makes a lot of sense. And as you said, it's going to promote better health of the soil. So, win-win. Yeah, and prairies do that very good, of course. So, I mean, the ultimate example is a thriving, healthy tallgrass prairie. I mean, they're putting lots of carbon into the soil. And the way they do that, of course, that's better than trees, is that because it's perennial herbaceous vegetation, for the most part. They are growing root systems every growing season. A root has to be actively growing to actually function as a root. And so during the whole growing season, the roots just continue to grow and grow and grow and get more branched and keep embedding more and more soil space. And then at the end of the season, in the fall, when those plants senesce, or the top parts of the plant die, the perennial part of the plant is the main roots portion, or maybe it's a lower portion of the stem of the plant that's perennial and is going to survive the winter and provide regrowth the next year. But most of that root system that was grown to feed and nourish the plant, that dies. And it dies right in place in the soil and decays at depth in the soil. So you can get organic matter going into the soil, you know, 10 feet down. And trees don't do that so much. Their root systems don't totally break down like that. They have more of a woody basis to the root system. So they certainly have some that breaks down, but a lot of the organic matter coming from a forest, and this is how soil scientists can distinguish between soils that form in the forest and soils that form in the prairie. Most of the organic matter in the forest is coming from the leaves, which fall onto the surface of the soil. And then the organic matter enters the soil from the top. Whereas in the prairie, again, it's mostly those root systems, extensive root systems that are breaking down and decaying in place down in soil from the surface to whatever depth they grow. So you're able to enrich a much greater portion of the soil volume with herbaceous plants and prairie than you can with trees. Again, the carbon argument for trees is that they're putting carbon into the wood.
Take time for one more question. We probably should cut it off.
Sure, go ahead.
The plant you call wild licorice is also called milkweed.
No, that's a different species.
It's a different species.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Same family, but different species. Yeah, it's a lot. Wild licorice is a lot smaller plant. It's about like this high or so. And Canada milkvetch, probably what you're thinking of, can be up like this or so. That's astragalus, and wild licorice is by Lycyrrhiza.
There's a couple of sites that has it.
Yeah. Oh, really? So is that a remnant, or is that planted then?
It's not.
Not clear which
It's
one.
not in an area that was disturbed with so I think it has to be a window.
Astragalus canadensis, milkfish. I didn't, that's what I, no, again, Iowa has roughly 1,600 native species, and I would guess at least half of them could be prairie plants, so 800 roughly prairie species. And I can only touch about, maybe 50 of those in one night. So again, you're seeing just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the diversity of plants and forbs. Astragalus canadensis is something that does pretty well in reconstructions and grows well from seed, but yeah, I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to determine when you see a population whether it's a remnant or not. Vascular, the wild licorice one, I know that it's, I've seen it at, what's the name of that prairie now that at Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation? It used to be Lorna Selbert's Prairie, north of Nevada. Carroll Prairie now, I think. There's a population of it there. That's a remnant. Well, again, thanks for coming out tonight, and maybe I'll see you out at Doolittle Prairie on one of those walks.